Do you have grammarphobia, which is a fear of grammar? Now, before we continue, I must confess, grammarphobia is not an officially recognized term. We made it up, yet it resonates with many because the sentiment it embodies is indeed widespread. Think about it. Do you know someone who shudders at the thought of grammar and wants nothing to do with it? Perhaps, if we're honest with ourselves, we might even find a hint of unease when the prospect of a semester dedicated to studying grammar arises. It's a common feeling, and you're not alone. Let me share an anecdote that encapsulates the struggles some face with grammar. Picture a fine spring day in the late 1970s in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Edgar Schuster, author of Breaking the Rules, Liberating Writers Through Innovative Grammar Teaching, recounts an incident where he was called to observe a veteran teacher, Miss Abbott. And Miss Abbott was guiding a first grade class through a lesson on grammar. Miss Abbott assigned 3 children cards labeled noun, verb, adjective, and placed them in separate corners. Then the remaining children would come forward and pick up a different card that had a word on it from a pile and took their chosen card to the correct category, to the correct corner. So whether it was a noun, verb, or adjective. Now imagine Amy, a frail first grader, confronted with the word wet. She hesitates and tentatively chooses the verb corner. Miss Abbott thunders, "Think, Amy, isn't wet a picture word?" Amy, now shaking and in tears, is left in an impossible situation. Schuster goes on to say, "I have never forgotten Amy, nor quite forgiven her teacher." This experience, marked by judgment and ambiguity, lays the foundation for grammarphobia, the fear of grammar. From this story, 2 crucial points emerge. First, it's disheartening when students are made to feel inadequate without valid reasons. In Amy's case, there was no right answer, as wet, the word wet, could function as an adjective, verb, or noun. How do you think Amy's relationship with grammar will develop after such an experience? The second consideration is that grammar, contrary to popular belief, is not a difficult subject. It's not rocket science. In fact, if you speak English, you already know all the English grammar you need, but you do so subconsciously. This is similar to how you know how fast to breathe during different types of activities. You just do it. But this course wants to give you a conscious access to grammar. Believe me when I say it's a lot easier to learn and understand grammar if we stop thinking about rules and instead talk about heuristics. Get familiar with this word. You'll see us refer to it every week. Heuristics are discovery procedures that unveil the subconscious knowledge you already possessed. Heuristics are like a set of shortcuts that help you test and make decisions. So let's look at an example, one not related to grammar. So imagine you're a child and you know the following heuristics about wood and rocks. You know wood floats in water and rocks sink. You know wood burns and rocks don't. You know wood is softer than rock. And you know rocks are typically found under or on the ground while wood is above ground, for example, in trees. So having this knowledge, you've found something in your backyard and now you're going to try and decide if you found a rock or a piece of wood. You're going to embark on the discovery process using heuristics. So you may get a bucket of water and see that the object sinks. Then you may try to set it on fire, but your parents confiscate your matches and the gasoline that you got from the shed, thus stopping you from gathering this data. However, you manage to get a hammer and after pounding the object, decide that it's pretty hard. Finally, you know that it was found on the ground. Therefore, you tentatively conclude that the object is a rock and not wood. Note that just like in a real research situation, you do not have access to all the data you need because remember, you couldn't test it with fire. And some of the results are ambiguous. This is to be expected. That's why heuristics are failure friendly. You know that some of the data will not be good or will not be available at all, but you expect the other heuristics to catch anything that falls through the net. Unlike rules, heuristics are probabilistic, failure-friendly, and comfortable with exceptions. The crucial difference lies in their approach to failure. Rules, on the other hand, are absolute and intolerant of exceptions, while heuristics embrace the possibility of failure, making them more conducive to learning. Let's look at an example. A rule is something along the lines of the Uber Eats driver always rings twice, period. If you hear 3 rings, then it can't be the Uber Eats driver because they ring twice. However, a heuristic is much more tolerant. If you hear 3 rings, maybe it is the Uber Eats driver with your food, but he just forgot to ring twice, or he made a mistake, or the doorbell jammed, or whatever. The point is, a heuristic is comfortable with the idea of failure. So let's say your heuristic is that if you hear 2 rings, it's probably the Uber Eats driver. However, if you open the door after 2 rings and it's your neighbors, well, you're okay with that because it may have not been the Uber Eats driver. Conversely, if your rule is that 2 rings absolutely means it is always the Uber Eats driver, and yet you open the door and you have your neighbor, that's a big problem. Because 1, your rule has just shown to be false. And 2, that means you're still waiting on your food. You may have heard or adopted the philosophy that rules have exceptions. Well, an exception to a rule is when the rule does not work. I can say that the rule for the plural in English is to add an S at the end of the word. For example, I can have 1 cat, but if I want to imply that I have more than 1 cat, the rule is to add S, so cats. But then we have a word like sheep, which doesn't take the plural S. So this word is an exception. The plural S rule does not work for this word. We can sum up the differences between rules and heuristics in this chart. Rules are absolute, whereas heuristics are probabilistic. Rules are pre-existing, where heuristics are discovery procedures. With rules, unlisted expectations are failures of the rule, whereas in heuristics, failures are planned and expected. With rules, any exceptions, like with the word sheep versus cats, they need to be memorized. Whereas in heuristics, when there are exceptions, well, those are accommodated by other heuristics. Rules discourage students from creative thinking, meaning there's only one correct rule, there's only one correct way. Heuristics, on the other hand, encourage students to find their own solutions. There may be more than one correct procedure to reach the answer. Ultimately, rules encourage fear of grammar, whereas heuristics make grammar obtainable and encourage enjoyment of grammar. Let's also consider grammar as a system. A system is a number of different things that serve a common purpose. The idea here is that language and its grammar form a purposeful system. Think of a radio. The purpose of a radio is to get music or speech broadcast somewhere to come out somewhere else. If you have a speaker, wires, an antenna, and some transmitters, you don't have a radio yet. You need to assemble these pieces in a system so that it does what it's supposed to do. Grammar is not a collection of random rules. It's not a collection of random parts. Grammar is a system. And as we said, its parts are intended to work together. Now, I stressed earlier that grammar is not a difficult subject, but I want to point out something. Here are some basic components of a radio. You have a circuit board, antenna, tuning coils, etc. If I gave all these pieces to you and said to build a radio, you might find it difficult. Why? Because I'm guessing you haven't studied how radios are made and what each of these parts does. Maybe you own a radio, so you have some heuristics that would give you some initial ideas on how to assemble it, but for the most part, you may not know where to start. On the one hand, learning grammar is going to be easier for you than learning how to build a radio. Why? Because 1, as I said earlier, if you speak English, you already have a subconscious grasp on grammar. We're just going to bring that to the surface. And 2, in our time together, I'm going to teach you about all the pieces. So then the big question is, what is the purpose of grammar? The purpose of grammar is to encode certain messages that we use frequently or significantly in language. The other meanings are, of course, carried by the words of the language. These meanings are then used to communicate ideas between people. We will get back to this. For the time being, remember that the grammar of a language is a system that encodes frequent and important messages. This has consequences. Just like in a radio, we would not expect to have 5 antennas or antennae if only one is necessary. In grammar, there are no random or frivolous parts. So if you wish to understand the system, you need to study all the parts. To put it differently, you cannot understand what a sentence is if you don't also know what a noun is or a verb is or vice versa. This is why we will start our study of grammar with an overview of the system. In conclusion, 2 essential takeaways. Grammar isn't as daunting as it seems, especially when approached through heuristics rather than rigid rules. And grammar is a system with a purpose, encoding meanings to convey information. To understand it fully, we must study all its parts. So fear not, Embrace the journey and let's explore the fascinating world of grammar together.